Thank you, Kellen. Good morning. It's a joy to be together for worship today. We continue to spend time in the Gospel of Mark this fall during our sermon times, and we're looking at a pretty big section this morning, chapter 4, verse 35 through the end of chapter 5. Seeing some panicked looks out there. Don't worry. Okay. Going to be several sermons in this series where we kind of look at the big picture of a large section, and I'll say some comments to kind of help us to see what's going on in the big picture, and then we'll zoom in on some shorter passages. So in this large section right here, the main thing that comes across is the unrivaled power and authority of Jesus. We see it first in the calming of the storm at sea. The wind and the waves obey Jesus. I mean, who commands the wind and the waves? He's unrivaled. Then we see the subduing of demonic forces and a man that nobody could restrain. That's followed by the healing of a woman that no doctor had been able to heal. And then Jesus raises a little girl from the dead. So you see a series of events: destructive storms, demonic spirits, death, and sickness. And in all of those, there's no contest. Jesus is unrivaled in power and authority. So that's the large section, but the small story that I want to zoom in and look at is the story of Jesus and the Gerasene demoniac, or the wild man of the tombs. It's chapter 5, 1 through 20. And I want to look at this story because it provides some information that we're going to need later on in the story of Mark. But also because as I read through this large section, I found it to be, just use the word alarming. Alarming in some ways that I needed. And I think as we look at this, you're going to find that it increases your spiritual alertness and awareness of spiritual dangers, but also, we could say kingdom priorities, things that are really important to Jesus. We're going to look at this story in three moves, or three interactions that Jesus has. It begins with the demons, and then an interaction with the community, and then with the man. So Mark chapter 5, verse 1. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. So this is Jesus and his disciples. They've had an eventful boat ride to get to the other side. That's where the storm was and the sea was calmed. And now they've arrived at the east side of the sea. This is Gentile territory. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. There's lots of uncleanness in this story. It's Gentile territory. There are tombs, unclean spirits. Later on, we're going to get to pigs. In other words, this is not the place that you expect a Jewish teacher to take his disciples. Verse 3, this man, he lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. No one could handle this wild man. And this has been going on for a long time. You noticed in there that it said he has often been bound. He's an outcast. He doesn't live in society. He lives among the tombs. He is dangerous to himself, as we'll see, and to others. He is oppressed by evil spirits. He is harshly treated by his community. It's hard to imagine a more miserable life. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out, cutting himself with stones. This is a picture of a man who is totally dehumanized by evil. This is the picture of the image of God disfigured and distorted. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." It's terrifying to think about that. This is not just a demon. This is an army of evil spirits. And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now, a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside. And they begged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs, let us enter them." So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. Okay, let's just pause there for a minute. I know that we've got a lot of questions about the pigs. I know there's some that are thinking, those poor pigs. What do the pigs do? And then what about the folks that owned them? I mean, there's a lot of questions that this text raises. And then we've got questions about the demons. I mean, why are they concerned to stay in the territory? And why pigs? And why does Jesus give them permission? I mean, there's so many things about this that are kind of baffling. And as I have studied this last week, I'll tell you there is no lack of thought or speculation. There are some interesting possibilities, and it would be worth taking some time to look at some of those. But I think at some point we just got to say, I don't know. There's some things the text doesn't tell us that we just don't know. But there are some things that are really clear, and that's what I want to focus in on. This is what is crystal clear. An army of demons is no match for Jesus. When you look at the big picture of what's happening here, that's what all of these stories are doing, is they're saying he is one with unrivaled power and authority. An army of demons is no match for Jesus. Evil was out of control in this man, unrestrained, unrestrainable. But then Jesus shows up and an army of demons start begging. The picture of the now demon-possessed pigs rushing into the sea where they drowned. When I read that, I can't help but think about Pharaoh's army when during the Exodus time, and they pursue the Israelites and they rush into the sea to their defeat. And I think there's something about this is saying that deliverance of God, deliverance by the mighty hand of God. That's what this story is telling you. Deliverance by the mighty hand of God. And I believe this is the good news of the text, that Jesus squares off against evil, and it is no contest. It's good news. We need to remember where our battle is. My morning devotional reading this week, part of it was in the letter of Ephesians. And just with this story in mind, reading Ephesians 6, where we're reminded we've got a spiritual battle. Our battle's not against flesh and blood. It's against the spiritual forces of evil, Paul says. These spiritual forces of evil war against us. They're destroying us. They are disfiguring and distorting what God means for us. Theologians talk about natural evil and moral evil. And as you look at the series of events in this large section, you see both. We see what we call natural evil, storms, sickness, death, those normal things we experience that are so difficult. And we see Jesus has power and authority over those. But then you've got what we call moral evil. And it's where we are given to something broken deep down, sometimes that we don't see, but we see the effects working out in destructive ways. And we see things like addiction and the havoc that is wreaking on humanity, rage, abuse, violent attacks, horrific, unspeakably horrific acts that we look at in our world and think, how could human beings even do that? This story has given us a picture of it. Evil is destructive. And yet what we're seeing in this text is that powerful and destructive forces are at work, but they are no match for the power of Christ. We've got to hear that. It's good news today. The other thing really clear in here is that a person's worth is no question for Jesus. We might read it and think, well, what about the pigs? But the text is saying, what about the man? The loss of the pigs, the economic cost to the community, it is nothing compared to the worth of a person's restoration. I worked for a while in downtown Lubbock, and just like any downtown city, you encounter the people who often live on the fringes of society, those that a large number of our society view with caution and are fearful toward. And among those, you often see those that are overpowered, who are addicted, doing some things that are self-destructive, pretty wild. And when I worked in that part of town, I recognized in my interactions with people like that, I recognized a tendency in myself, and I think it's a human tendency, to see a certain kind of person and make value judgments about that person. And I'm so struck by this story. Jesus sees a person, not a certain kind of person. He values the person. And we see it throughout these stories. It is the unclean, the alienated, the overpowered, the violent, the immoral, the wildly sinful that he came to save, to set free, and deliver. It's great worth of a person to Jesus. Now, the second interaction we see Jesus having is with the community. So, chapter 5, verse 14. The herdsmen fled, and they told it in the city and in the country. And people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there, clothed, and in his right mind. And they were afraid. Now, when you're reading the big picture story, you start seeing some repetition in here. The same thing is happening that happened in the story right before this with the calming of the sea. Jesus transforms the dangerous wildness to calm. There's this great calm after the storm of the wild man. You've got him sitting there clothed and in his right mind, fully restored. But you also see in both stories a reaction of fear. You notice here it says that they were afraid, and you might wonder why. It's just, a reaction to power, foreign power, the economic impact that they could foresee. Raise all kinds of questions. But in both stories, after the sea and after this one, you see that there is a greater fear after the event than there was toward the evil itself, the disaster or the threat initially. This is the man of unrivaled power and authority, and there is a response of recognizing there's not anybody like this. There's something fearful about this great power. Verse 16. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs. Don't you love the way Mark throws that in there? And to the pigs. And they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. Now, just notice the repetition that's in here. The demons, what do? They begged Jesus. And now the community begs Jesus, begging him to leave. A couple of things I think we need to hear in this interaction. The first is what we are unable to tame, Jesus is able to transform. The community had tried to restrain the man. They tried in some way to tame evil, to keep it managed. But Jesus shows up, and he's not just able to restrain evil, he totally restores the man. He transforms him. We see in our world, every day, we have an effort to restrain evil. We see evil at work, and there's all kinds of efforts to restrain it. We see it in ourselves. We recognize that it's at work in us. And we are working terribly hard to restrain sin, to hold back. And I don't know about you, but I found that I try so hard, but sin breaks every chain I put on it. Have you noticed that? There is something about the power of sin and evil at work in the world and in us that we don't have the power to deal with. We come up short. It is frustrating. But the encouraging message of this text is that Jesus has power over that which we're powerless before. That he can deal with what we have proved over and over again we can't. We don't have enough. And he's not merely interested in restraining sin. He doesn't just want us to not do certain things. He is completely transforming our human disfigurement into his own likeness. We see that all throughout the Bible. This is what God is doing, restoring that image. Second thing from this portion that has helped me, what Jesus is willing to do, we may not be willing to accept. He comes to the other side. He shows us great unrivaled power and authority, and they beg him to leave. They had their reasons. Maybe it's going to be costly for him to stick around. Maybe that's too much disruption. They had their reasons, and I think we do too sometimes. As we listen to Jesus, we'll find that following him, discipleship to him, is costly and disruptive. It will turn upside down the life you had planned for yourself. It is a costly path. He calls you to things that are hard. And sometimes we might think, you know what, that's just more transformation than I wanted. I kind of had a plan for my life. I kind of had these things that I don't really want you to mess with that. I've told the story somewhere. I don't know if it was here, just to some of you before, but again, when I worked downtown Lubbock, there was a woman named Glenda, and she would come around pretty often asking for money to go to McDonald's. And I would tell her the same thing. Well, no, I won't give you money, but we've got lots of food here. Let's go see what we've got. And so we'd go through the refrigerator and pull things out, and I was offering her all kinds of things. And she'd say no. She'd have a reason why this wouldn't work or that wouldn't work, and I'd pull more out. No. And finally, she just said, really, I just got a hankering for a cheeseburger. And I've always remembered that because I see myself in it. You know, what the Lord is offering, sometimes I'm thinking, you know what, that's not really what I wanted. He is able to do and willing to do something that I desperately need, but sometimes I don't want it. Sometimes I know what I want, and it doesn't align with the will of God. I think another reason why maybe we resist the full treatment of discipleship, the complete and total life-changing work that Jesus wants to do in us, one of the reasons I think that we might be resistant to it or uninterested or dismissive of it is because we fail to recognize how destructive evil is. We think that it's not really hurting anything. That compared to other people, this bad that I'm involved in is not really that serious. And we think that the sin in our life is not really that big a deal. It's always a big deal. Sin and evil is destructive. It is disfiguring. It is distorting us. It happens slow sometimes and we don't recognize it. And I think part of this story is giving us a picture of the destruction of evil. It disfigures the human image, the image of God in us. And so the scriptures call us to go in for the full treatment. Be really serious about sin. If you listen to Jesus, he will have you be serious about sin. The New Testament will use the language of putting sin to death. And I want to be really clear. You can only do that by the power of the Holy Spirit in you. It's only by the power of the one with unrivaled power and authority that we can make any progress in that area. Otherwise, it's frustrating. But the scriptures call us to be deadly serious about sin, to put it to death. There's a theologian in the 1600s, okay, we're going way back, named John Owen, famously said this, "Be killing sin or it will be killing you." That's great. I mean, that sounds like something somebody would say today. It's part of a larger quote where he uses some King James sounding words, but this sticks with you. Be killing sin or it will be killing you. And again, you can only do that by the power, that unrivaled power at work in you. Otherwise, you're frustrated. But you got to be serious about it and recognize the truth that if you don't, if you ignore it, it's working destruction in your life. It is a big deal. It is terribly distorting to the human image. But with Jesus, there is power to change. The question is, will we accept his costly and disruptive work, or would we rather he leave certain things alone? tough, challenges me. The third interaction is with the man himself. Verse 18. As he was getting into the boat, so they had asked him to leave, and so he does, gets back into the boat. The man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. Now, being with him, that's the language of discipleship. It's already been used in Mark so far. That's what Jesus called his apostles to come be with him. He's saying, I want to go with you. I want to be a disciple. I want to follow you. Look at verse 19. And he did not permit him, but he said to him, go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. So you notice the repetition. The demons beg, then the community begs, and now this restored man begs. But there's a twist right here. Because for the first time, Jesus doesn't give permission. He answers with a negative. And that's perplexing, because this is the first one who asked for something that made any sense. The other questions were baffling to us, and yet Jesus permits them. And then this man says what we think is the right thing, to say, I want to go with you, let me be with you. I want to be a disciple. And Jesus doesn't give permission. What's going on? Well, one thing that's really clear is that Jesus has a mission for this man. He wants him to stay in the region, to tell his friends and his family what the Lord has done for him. And it's actually, this entire story is impressing this on us, that Jesus is on a mission for others. That's why he was crossing the sea to begin with. He's going to the other side. He's going to Gentile territory. It's a little hint at where this gospel is going, well beyond Israel and the Jewish people. This is a mission for the nations. We're seeing early indications of that. He crosses to the other side, to Gentile territory, and they are unreceptive. They ask him to leave. But he's not done. It's not that easy to get rid of Jesus, okay? He leaves a man with a mission. This wild man becomes a missionary preacher, the first of his kind in the Gospel of Mark. He is not only restored, he is repurposed for the mission of God. So 3 things that I want to leave us with to take home today. I think this story leads us to consider who we might tell how much Jesus has done for us. Pretty straightforward application. This past week, I got to speak with a young lady who's in a PhD program at Texas Tech, and which, by the way, great game yesterday. She's in this PhD program and on track for a very successful career. She's put a lot into it. And over the last year or so, she has decided this isn't what she wants to do with her life. And she's changing courses. And she said, the most important thing is that Jesus is coming back. And she said, I want my whole life to be lived with that in view. She doesn't know exactly what that means. She's, I think this last week, she's visiting with some people about some missionary work that's being done with women and children in Rwanda. And she's turning over the whole track her life has been on to make it about the mission of God. And I was pretty inspired by that this week. But I think sometimes when we think missions, we get worried that God's going to send us to Rwanda. and he might. I think we got to be willing for him to disrupt our life and to call us to something costly. But it doesn't always mean going to Rwanda. Sometimes he has work for you among your friends, in your home, with your family, in your community, and it might be more simple than you think, just telling people what Jesus has done for you. I think we overcomplicate it sometimes. Maybe he's got work for us to do just in our normal everyday interactions, the people that we know, just being willing to tell them how we have found mercy and help from our God. Pretty simple. Secondly, I think this story challenges us to examine any inward resistance to the transformative work of the Holy Spirit. The Lord is willing and able to work remarkable transformation in our life. Are we accepting? Are we listening? Are we yielded to that, surrendered to that great work? He doesn't just do it for us. He calls us to submit to it. Are we surrendered to it? Lastly, know the immeasurable worth of every person to God. And that includes you, that you know what you are worth to God. This story is bringing it out, that a person's worth is no question for Jesus. Every person has great worth to him, including you. The gospel story itself is telling us that. We're going to get to the cross. The cross is telling you what you are worth to God. And it's telling you what your neighbor is worth to God. There's a really inspiring observation that many have observed about this story, and that's that when you get to the end of the Gospel of Mark, it appears that Jesus has swapped places with the wild man of the tombs. I want to kind of paraphrase the way that N.T. Wright explains this because I think he puts it really well. At the climax of Mark's story, it is Jesus rather than the wild man who is naked, isolated, outside the town, among the tombs. It is Jesus whose flesh is cut by the stones and the Roman lash. It's Jesus who's making loud shouts in his miserable condition. It's Jesus who's bound by the standard form of Roman torture, the cross. It is Jesus who's taking the full force of evil on himself and letting us go free. That is the measure of your worth to God. And that is the power of what Jesus and Jesus alone can do for you. I don't know how you need to respond today. I know that for me, it has brought up in me fresh gratitude for the way God views me, what he offers, what he's done, what he can do. And it's also drawn out a desire to be more devoted, more submitted to what he's doing in my life. I hope that it also provokes a response of faith, greater confidence in what he has achieved for you, what only he can do for you. Maybe today you need to respond for the first time by putting your faith in Jesus and confessing your sin, turning from it, being baptized into him, into his death and in his resurrection, into that great victory that he accomplished for you, that he invites you into. If you would, respond now while we stand and sing.